It's not going to take a lot of time. One of the things, and we kind of went over this when we went over writing philosophy. If you're writing on someone else, a good thing to do is to summarize the position that you're going to discuss, which does two things. If it were something in a journal or something, frequently in a journal article, you get a summary. If somebody is writing on somebody else and on some issue, somebody might pick up the journal who can understand the debate, but just isn't up to speed with where things are in that particular area of debate. And so summarizing somebody's argument or position might bring somebody up to speed who would be interested in reading what you have to say, but also it lets people know how you understand the position and whether you have it right, you know. So a good thing to do, and even in a short essay question, a good thing to do, you know, before you get out your own view on a question is to, you know, assume that the reader isn't me. Assume the reader is somebody who can understand what you have to say, but is ignorant of the topic, and that you have to bring them up to speed. So you sort of demonstrate that you understand, you know, what you're talking about. So the design argument, we're not going to look at the problem of evil before, well, we may do it before the test, but we're not going to do it. It's not going to be on the test. But since we did the design argument last time in both Aquinas and Paley's versions, we're going to look at this. And like I say, this is one of the three things that Hume wanted to be remembered for. So Hume, what he does, and these slides were done right from Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, but really from a big section of it that was printed in a philosophy text I used to use. Now, I think there's some in your text as well, and I'm sure I have the pages down there. So Hume summarizes the argument, and the argument, most people look at it as an argument from analogy. What you do when you argue from analogy is you say, well, you know what? A and B, A is like B in respects 1, 2, and 3, and that's your premise. These two things are alike in some respects. Your conclusion is, well, if they're alike in respects 1, 2, and 3, maybe they're also going to be alike, probably they'll be alike in respect 4. And so the design argument basically draws an analogy between things that are made by us, right, designed and built by us, like watches for Paley. It draws an analogy between those things and things like the eye. You know, Paley says, well, what is it that made the watch different from the stone? If I found both, you know, in a field, in a heath, if I stumbled on a stone, I wouldn't think it was anything special. I think, for all I know, it's been there forever and just produced by natural forces. But he says if I found a watch, I wouldn't think that. And he says, well, why wouldn't I think it about the watch, that for all I know, it it had just been laying there forever. The forces of nature just happened to produce a watch in the same way they produced a stone. Why wouldn't I draw that conclusion? And Paley says the reason is because, and of course, no digital watches around in 1802, right? We're talking about tick-tock watches with gears and springs and all that. He says because the watch is an intricate mechanism with parts that work together to fulfill a particular purpose, namely, enabling the hands to move so that we can use the instrument to tell time with. So there's one thing you're comparing, things like watches. And Paley says, but look at something like the human eye. He says, isn't this something that, like the watch, has a lot of intricate parts, and if you look at a diagram of the eye, it's got a lot of parts that work together to fulfill a purpose. Right? So you're saying A is like B in certain respects. Therefore, maybe they're alike in the respect of needing a designer. In other words, the watch didn't just get there. Someone designed it to fulfill the purpose that it fulfills. Right? And Paley says, well, shouldn't we conclude the same thing about something like the human eye? That it didn't just get there like the stone by the forces of nature, that it, was designed and needed a designer. But of course, who would the designer of the eye be but the author of nature, God himself, right? And so the argument, the design argument is basically an argument from analogy. But Hume is going to argue that it's a bad argument from analogy. And of course, modern defenders of evolutionary theory would say, well, we can account for the eye over millions of years by progressively, more complex eyes, being developed through natural selection and mutations. So Hume, at the beginning, summarizes the design argument. So, don't confuse him with presenting it. He's summarizing it, and the character that gives the argument is a character named Cleanthes. And Hume makes up this name, and it's a made-up name that has two parts of a Greek word in it. Hoanthropos, right, we have anthropology, the study of human beings. And thees, from theos, the word for God. So Cleanthes is somebody who wants to give God, human characteristics. And he's the one who presents the design argument, because the conclusion of the design argument we're going to see is that basically God, like us, is an intelligence. So the world is a machine subdivided into an infinite number of smaller machines, the clockwork universe. This is very much Newton's view. All machines and their parts are admirably and accurately adjusted to one another. Just like the watch, things in nature, have parts. And here's where purpose comes in. Throughout nature, means are adapted to ends in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design. In other words, the way they're constructed, the means, are adapted to the ends or purposes that they serve. Like the parts of the eye are adapted to serving the purpose of providing us with sight. Right? So remember, another name for the design argument comes directly from the Greek word telos, which is an end or goal or purpose. I may have put this on the board before, but it won't hurt to do it again. So the design argument is also called the teleological argument. To accent the fact that the argument focuses on the fact that things in nature seem to work together to work for various purposes or ends. I'm sorry, did you have your hand up? No. Oh, okay. So the idea is that if the effects, the products of design, resemble each other, by analogy, the causes, the designers must resemble each other also. And if the watch needed a designer, so the argument goes, so does a complex mechanism like the human eye. So the author of nature, it's capitalized because we're referring here to God. As a conclusion, we can conclude that the author of nature has a mind much like the human mind, only God has much more developed and advanced features than our features, and we can read this from the fact that things in nature are more complex than the things we as humans make. God has larger faculties since the products of divine design are grander than the products of human design. So the conclusion is that God exists and also that God has an intelligence similar to human intelligence. So at that point, what Hume is doing then is summarizing the design argument. He's putting into the mouth of the character Cleanthes the design argument. Now, there are two other characters, Damia, who's a kind of ordinary man on the street, woman on the street type of very traditional believer. Okay? And then we also already saw Cleanthes. And then the character in the dialogue, which we'll see represents Hume, is Philo, the philosopher, the skeptical philosopher. So Damia doesn't like the fact that the design argument is nothing but an inductive probabilistic argument. And it is. All arguments from analogy are not airtight mathematical arguments. They're not what we call deductive arguments in logic. Because what are you saying? You're saying, okay, A and B are alike in the respects 1, 2, and 3. Therefore, probably, they're also alike in the respect 4. So all you get is a certain probability, and with inductive arguments, they can be weak or strong. And Hume's going to argue that it's a weak analogy that this argument rests on. But Damia doesn't like the fact that it's based on experience. This word a posteriori, you can see the word post in there, after experience. Arguments a posteriori are arguments based on experience, and the design argument and the cosmological argument are that way. They get off the ground by citing factors in our experience of the world. And so, depends on an observed similarity of the deity to men. As such, it is only a probable argument. And that's true. What Damia likes are a priori arguments like the ontological argument that claim to prove their conclusion not with some sort of probability, but with absolute logical certainty. You know, where it's a contradiction to accept the premises and deny the truth of the conclusion. In a probabilistic argument, you can accept the premises and deny the truth of the conclusion without contradicting yourself. So Damia doesn't like these types of arguments to begin with, but Philo says, look, my quarrel with this argument is not that it's only a probabilistic argument, not that it's only an inductive argument, this argument from analogy, but he says he doesn't object that the design argument is probable, but he objects that the design argument is not as strong as other probable arguments. He says if we all have arguments where we're comparing apples with apples, to use a common cliche, right? That a stone will fall. I was looking at a friend's house a month or two ago. She had cable and I didn't, and they had this show about prospectors, and here these guys are digging, trying to find some gold or gems on a mountainside, but there are some loose rocks above them. And I'm saying, watch out. We got to watch out for that rock. It might loosen itself up and fall. Well, you know what a rock's going to do if it loosens itself up, because you've seen rocks fall, right? You know what would happen to this cup. Fortunately, it doesn't have much of anything in it anymore. If I knock it off, it's going to fall. In other words, there are things that we, you know, if I say don't knock that cup off, it's going to spill everything. I'm pretty certain that that's what it's going to do if you knock it off the end of the desk, right? Because we've all knocked stuff off. So Hume says there are lots of cases where we're comparing apples with apples. You know, we know that a stone's going to fall because we've seen what happens, or that a fire's going to burn, right? I know that if I'm lighting a candle or something with a match or the gas flame, I better not hold on to that match very long, or the fire's going to creep up there and could burn my fingers, right? And you know that too. That fire will burn, that the earth is a solid entity. These are based on thousands of like observations. And he says the exact similarity of these cases assures us of a similar event, right? You take out another match. You don't think you're wasting your time striking that match on the striker, because you've seen what happens when you strike the match on that little strip. The match lights, right? So we have a lot of these things. But what Hume is going to try to convince us of is that we're not comparing similar things. First of all, he says, if we're talking about the design of the whole universe, the whole world, and here world is used as kind of synonym for the universe, how many examples of this do we have? Well, we only have one, the universe we're in. Now, somebody may think there are parallel universes, and it amazes me that some modern physicists are giving credence to that view, which I think is absolutely unlikely, but at any rate. But he says we have only one example of design to go from our present world or universe, so it may be only a weak analogy because we're not comparing similar things, and we have only one instance. So Hume doesn't like this, but also he doesn't like our comparing like Paley wants to do, the products of human design to things in nature like the eye. And now here Hume wants to teach us, he assumes that his readers may not know everything about the way arguments from analogy work. So he wants to teach the point to us that arguments from analogy can be good if you're comparing apples with apples, not so good if you're comparing apples with oranges. I mean, to put it in contemporary, down-to-earth speech. So he says, departing from the similarity of the compared cases diminishes the evidence proportionally. It says, here's an example, the circulation of blood. If we're talking about concluding that blood circulates in you the way blood circulates in me, or that blood circulates in you the way it does to the person sitting next to you, he says, it's beyond doubt to conclude that blood circulates in other humans from the observation of human blood circulation, right? There, we're really comparing similar cases. Okay? And this is what we do. Don't we do this when pharmaceutical companies are developing a drug? Haven't you heard news items before where they say, okay, we might have a drug that works well on against AIDS, or works well on Alzheimer's, or diminishes a certain amount of type of cancer, but they'll say, so far it's worked in rats and other lab animals, but now we've got to start doing human trials. Why? Because the analogy might not work for humans. We need really similar cases now. You know, just because something works on a rat or a lab animal like a rabbit, it doesn't mean that it's going to work on us. So further evidence is needed. We need a closer comparison. But still, if it does work on rats, that justifies our doing some clinical trials, because we know, hey, we're on the right track. At least this drug is doing something favorable in the case of a lab animal. You know, why don't we take it to the next level and test the drug on human beings now, on something that's even closer, or that's the closest to where we want to, go. So we make these kinds of observations, but Hume says you can still then have a good argument if you compare the way blood circulates in other animals, like a frog or a fish, to the way it circulates in human beings. It's not as strong an argument, but it's a good argument. But then Hume says we can be led astray if we're comparing very dissimilar things. One of the things that's happening out there, and it's still very green. You know, you go out in the county and leaves are turning much more. The leaves start turning. You know, now I had to take some biology when I was in college. And I know what happens. The sap goes down to the roots in the wintertime, along with the chlorophyll, leaving the xanthophyll and carotene, and that's what gives the leaves their orange and yellow color in the fall, right? Those are left, and the chlorophyll that gives them their green color is down there. In other words, if you ever cut a weed or break one and you see little tubules, well, you might be led to conclude that because there are little tubules and things like corn stalks that in a way resemble the little tubes that are our blood vessels, that maybe Sap in vegetables circulates in them the way it does, the way blood does in us. But it would be a wrong analogy. You're comparing things that are very far apart, and you're being led to a wrong conclusion because blood circulates in us, but sap does not circulate. It goes up in the spring and it comes down to the roots in the fall, and that's what's happening now. But it doesn't keep on circulating around. So we could be led to a wrong conclusion. Circulation of sap in vegetables could be wrongly concluded by analogy from blood circulation in animals. Similar effects, similar causes. My old home in Hamden, the records only go back to 1900. That's as far as Baltimore City has them. It was probably built before 1900. Now, folks, 1900, believe it or not, was not even I was around in 1900, right? That's a long time before Professor Borowski came on the scene. I wasn't around. We didn't own, my parents didn't move into that house until 1955. I wasn't around in 1900, but I have no doubt whatsoever that somebody built that house. It didn't just spring up on its own, right? Whenever I see a house and somebody just got a contract and right across from where I live, they're building an apartment complex, Well, we know that houses need to be built. They don't just spring up overnight. And so I have no doubt from comparing similar cases that my house had to be designed and built. On seeing a house, we conclude with the greatest certainty that it had a builder. Houses we have observed in the past have had builders, so this one must have had one too, right? I have no doubt that somebody designed and built that house. But he says, is the universe like a house? He says, aren't we comparing something that's very dissimilar? And the presumption of a similar cause, that a house must have had a builder, so the universe must have had a designer and builder. A watch must have had a designer and builder, so the universe must have had a designer and builder. Hume says, here we're really comparing things that are very dissimilar. And the presumption of a similar cause, that is that a designer and builder was needed for the universe, is only for him a guess, a conjecture, a presumption. It's not a solid conclusion about which we have good evidence from analogy, because we're not comparing very similar cases. This is one of Hume's main points. But also, now remember, Hume is not a scientist, but all these people read up on scientific topics. But Philo and Cleanthes, Philo again represents Hume in the dialogue, agree that the following would only be proof of design if shown by experience to proceed from it. In other words, if we had evidence that order was produced by design, or that the arrangement of the parts of the watch are produced by design, or when we say adjustment to final causes, Aristotle had what he called a final cause of a thing, which is the end at which it aims, right? If you're a sculptor and you're going to make a statue, the final cause you're aiming at is, the statue to adorn the park. If you're talking about something in nature like an acorn, the final cause that's pulling it forward is becoming an oak tree. So he says we don't have any past evidence that this is the case. In other words, Hume is going to argue that even if we have order in nature, it may not be due to design. So a priori, the above could be caused by something internal to matter itself. And of course, this is also the claim. Now, Paley criticizes this and says, well, I don't know what you mean by an internal principle in matter that tends toward order. Give me more evidence, Hume. You're speculating that there might be, but are we certain that there is one? But this is the claim of evolution, that internal principles that work to produce, variations, mutations, and that sometimes work to produce advantageous variations, like more complex eyes, that those forces in nature, along with natural selection, can tend toward more and more order and more complex eyes. So Hume says there might be a cause just within matter itself of order. Matter may cause its own order as well as the mind by design can do. So the elements may fall into some exquisite arrangement by some unknown internal material cause. And that does happen in nature, right? I remember in my old chemistry book when I was a kid, I went through my various scientific phases. There was the instructions for how to make sugar crystals, how to make the old-fashioned rock candy. Anybody ever do that as a project? Now you might not nowadays want your kids eating the stuff, right, because it's solid sugar. But basically, you take domino sugar, right? You put it in water, you heat it up. The sugar is going to dissolve in the hot water. Then you put a string there. You let the water cool with the string somehow supported, and the sugar crystals form. They look like quartz crystals on that string, and that's how rock candy is made, a little rainy day project. And so you get things falling into exquisite arrangement just by the laws of nature. Or consider, he says it's as easy to conceive as that the divine mind is the source of this order and arrangement. I say note the similarity to Darwin. So Hume speculates about other possible forces in nature like magnetism. Here again, he's just throwing out these as possibilities. This is not worth spending a lot of time on. Cleanthes even brings up the eye, that there are millions of examples of design, and this is Paley's position. Has structure that implies a contriver, that it is the product of design, he said, is the most obvious conclusion. And this is what people who advance the design argument say, that maybe that there's a real designer is the most obvious conclusion. He says, frivolous, abstruse arguments of the skeptic against design are less easily arrived at and obvious. And, we have others, examples of design besides the eye, like the organs we use for sexual reproduction. Now, just to where he's going here is, Hume says, here we have an imperfect world. We're supposed to conclude that even though the world is finite, it's contingent, it's imperfect, nonetheless, the designer of the world is not finite but infinite, doesn't have a contingent but a necessary existence, is not imperfect like things in this world, but is perfect. And Hume says that's not a good logical argument. Now, I don't spend as much time on that because I made up these slides to parallel the parts that were in a particular text that I was using at the time up in Carroll County. But he says even if the world were perfect, we couldn't conclude that the maker of the world is perfect. from the complexity and beauty of a ship. A friend of mine and I went down to see the tall ships when they were down there, you know. We could form an exalted idea of the ingenuity of the carpenter who made it, but the carpenter, he says, might be just a stupid mechanic who imitated others and copied an art. I mean, we could look at something like this and say, wow, you know, the person who made these slides, you know, must have really been quite an artist, and that's impressive, you know. Whereas, you know, is really just a stupid mechanic who cut and pasted a graphic in there, and he, meaning me, has little or no artistic abilities. And so this is what Hume is saying. First of all, we have an imperfect world, and arguing from an imperfect world to a perfect designer is not a good argument. But he says, even if I gave you the presupposition that we had a perfect world, he says it doesn't mean that the designer had to be perfect. Paley turns that around, and he says even if the watch is imperfect, it doesn't mean that the designer is imperfect. So the maker would not be necessarily perfect. Now here you got to see where Hume is going. Hume is not saying that he thinks the real designer of the universe is an inept, infantile deity who made the world as a botched and bungled world, much like you would do if you were taking a pottery course and you screwed up with the first things you did, you know, and you threw it away because you were just learning. But what the point Hume is trying to make by throwing out these possibilities is that more than one conclusion is possible for the design argument. Okay? And he says, why must there even be just one designer? Maybe the world was built by committee. So he's trying to say that once you make God finite and not infinite, there are lots of possibilities. So Hume's trying to say that somebody like Aquinas or Paley, who conclude that the maker and the designer of the world has to have been the God of the Bible and church tradition,